Welcome to the Pod-Key summary of House of Plantagenet. The Plantagenets are one of those dynasties that look simple from a distance and wildly complicated up close. They helped turn England from a king-centered feudal realm into something more negotiated and law-bound, even while their own family politics kept blowing holes in the system. And one of the strangest parts is that the name we use for them now, Plantagenet, only really became the dynasty's big unifying label long after most of them were dead. One of the biggest long-term stories here is that Plantagenet kings didn't just rule England. They accidentally helped redesign how it was ruled. Magna Carta is the famous landmark, but the broader pattern matters just as much. Kings needed money and military backing, and in exchange they kept having to accept limits, restatements, and clearer obligations to the realm. Over time, royal power got tied more tightly to courts, law, and consent. The king was still powerful, very much so, but less free to act as if the whole kingdom were just personal property with sheep on it. Under Edward IX, that process took another big step. War was expensive, and the crown needed wider approval for taxation, so Parliament brought together not only barons and clergy, but also knights and burgesses. That mattered, because it widened participation in decisions about money. And once you create a precedent like that, it tends to stick around. You can see the same struggle from another angle in the conflict between Henry II and Thomas Becket. At heart, it was a fight over jurisdiction. Henry wanted greater royal control over church courts and church personnel, and Becket defended the church's independence. This wasn't abstract constitutional theory for its own sake. It was about who had authority in daily life, who could try whom, and where power stopped. Becket's murder turned Henry into a political and religious disaster zone. The king had to perform a very public penance, which is a sharp reminder that even strong medieval rulers could get trapped by the consequences of overreach. Then there's the thing people often call the Angevin Empire, which sounds neat and unified and really wasn't. It was a huge bundle of territories: Normandy, Anjou, Aquitaine, Gascony, and others, but those lands kept their own laws, traditions, and feudal ties. This was less a single state than a ruler juggling a lot of very different inheritances. Even the label is retrospective and disputed. There doesn't seem to have been a contemporary collective name for all these possessions, and historians have argued over whether calling it an empire makes the whole arrangement sound more coherent than it really was. In fact, a 1986 historians' convention rejected the idea that there had been an actual Angevin state and preferred the term espace Plantagenet. That loose structure helps explain why John's loss of Anjou and most of the continental lands mattered so much. It shifted the dynasty's center of gravity toward England and widened the split between English and French interests for the generations that followed. For the Plantagenets, dynastic marriage was one of the most effective tools of expansion. Geoffrey of Anjou's marriage to Empress Matilda eventually helped bring their son Henry II to the English throne, and Henry's marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine added one of the largest duchies in Europe. So marriage built power, but it also built chaos. Inheritance claims crossed borders, crossed family branches, and crossed gender lines. And every one of those crossings could become a political argument with armed supporters attached. Richard died childless. John's seizure of the throne was disputed. Later on, competing lines through Lionel of Clarence and Edmund of York fed directly into civil war. It's one of those classic royal problems. The family tree keeps expanding until it starts looking less like a tree and more like a legal fire. By the 15th century, the dynasty's problems weren't just about one bad battle or one unlucky king. The system itself was under strain. Succession failures piled up, governance weakened, and elite loyalty became shakier. Nobles maintained private armies, pursued feuds, and challenged Henry VI's authority pretty openly. The Wars of the Roses grew out of rivalry between Lancastrian and Yorkist branches, but the claims were incredibly tangled. Richard of York could point to descent from Edward III through both his father's line and his mother's line. He even adopted Plantagenet as a surname in 1448 to highlight that ancestry, which is a fascinating reminder that dynastic branding is not a modern invention. Richard III's death at Bosworth in 1485 ended Plantagenet rule and, in the usual period labels, closed the English Middle Ages. But that didn't mean the bloodline stopped mattering. Plantagenet descended claimants, legitimate and illegitimate, stayed politically dangerous for decades, including Edward of Warwick, the De la Poles, and Margaret Pole. Another important shift during this dynasty is cultural. Edward III's reign helped solidify a more distinctly English royal identity. Middle English became increasingly important in government, which is why the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography describes Edward III as culturally the first English Plantagenet ruler. That's a real change from the earlier world of rulers whose political lives were deeply tied to lands across the Channel. But later, Plantagenet instability also unfolded during brutal social and economic pressure. The Black Death may have killed about a third of the population, which is almost impossible to overstate. Then, in the mid-15th century came the Great Slump. With harvest failures, livestock disease, piracy, loss of French territory, collapsing trade, and a general sense that everything expensive was getting worse. By the late 1440s, cloth exports had dropped 35% in 4 years, and in parts of the Southwest, the fall may have reached 90%. The Crown's finances were also a mess. Debts reached £372,000. Henry VI ran an annual deficit of about £20,000, and tax revenues were only half what his father had enjoyed. So when political order started cracking, it wasn't happening in a healthy, prosperous kingdom with lots of spare patience. And finally, the name itself. Plantagenet feels ancient and fixed now, but it wasn't originally the dynasty's standard contemporary name. It goes back to the 12th century nickname Plantagenest, probably linked to the bright yellow broom plant, and it was Richard of York who revived it as a family surname during the Wars of the Roses. That move helped him stress his patrilineal descent from Geoffrey of Anjou and sharpen his political identity against the Lancastrians. Historians didn't start using Plantagenet routinely for the whole ruling line until the late 17th century. So the dynasty gives us a useful historical lesson. Royal houses aren't only inherited, they're also assembled in memory. A family that ruled England for centuries got its defining collective name after most of its kings had already come and gone. That's the Plantagenet story in miniature. State building, family feuds, legal innovation, economic strain, and a dynasty whose afterlife turned out to be almost as interesting as its reign. They helped shape constitutional monarchy, English identity, and the political map of late medieval England, even if they wouldn't have agreed on what to call themselves while doing it. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.